Hi friends, I want to talk about video essays and I want to talk about how bullshit they are. And I say that semi-jokingly, so don't get upset with me. So the thing about video essays is that they are pseudo-academic rather than actually academic. And I recognize this even as a YouTuber who makes this kind of content that um, look at my gaming culture series, for example. That was meant to be like basically a published rough draft of an academic paper and not a final draft of an academic paper. This is not meant to be something that gets published and peer reviewed, but I still went through the hassle of getting as many citations as I could for backing up what I was trying to say and also trying to make very convincing arguments to the best of my ability. And so that series of mine is sort of pseudo-academic. I am in college. I'm a college student. I have a history of doing these kinds of, essays where I actually have to cite sources and stuff like that. And so, like, when I do the video, I'm sort of just doing what I do in college, but doing it online. But it's not like this material is qualifying as an academic paper, so it's pseudo-academic. And that's true of a lot of video essays. A lot of video essayists, they make these videos that feel very well thought out and very well sourced. And sometimes they're not even well sourced, and then other times they are, but it's still ultimately an opinion piece and not like an academic journal. It's an opinion piece. It's essentially a vlog. And the reason why I say this is because the video essay format has one major problem that I'm going to address in this podcast, which is we have a problem with objectivity. The thing about objectivity is you can portray anything as objective as long as you construct the way you talk about it. And basically what happens is I make videos from an extremely subjective perspective. I make, my video on The Shining, for example, this is how I felt as I watched The Shining. It's meant to catalog my feelings towards a movie, not meaning to catalog like, some sort of objective fact about what the movie is. And when I make that video, I get tons of comments of people saying this analysis is bad because it's not objective enough. It's not objective. That's not the point. The point of the video is that it's subjective. That's the goal. And the funny thing about this is that the counterpoint to that would be, what does an objective video essay look like? And when I think of that, what springs to mind is stuff like Every Frame of Painting and Nerdwriter. People who have this sort of authoritative pseudo-academic tone, and they talk technicals. They talk about the way that David Fincher frames a shot and stuff like that. They talk about it in terms of how things are and not what they mean or why it matters. And sometimes they do talk about why it matters, but they talk about it in terms of like how it might hypothetically affect an audience, how it might hypothetically affect the viewer, the abstract notion of the viewer. And I don't care for that style. A lot of people do care for it. A lot of people like it, and that's fine. You're allowed to like that. But the problem is we've devalued the subjective perspective on art and on film. And that bothers me dearly as someone who does a lot of very subjective perspective videos, because there's sort of an issue going on in here where they're trying to avoid a bigger, deeper discussion. Let me talk about, for example, my experiences as a college student, right? So I've read books, I've read academic papers, I've read studies and surveys, I've read these kinds of things in mass. I've read a ton of them. And the thing about it is that I find all of this information that I really love. And the reason why I really love it is because it's teaching me things that I didn't already know, but that I kind of felt. Like it teaches me things that I wanted to know, but I wasn't fully aware of. Like if I had this hunch, for example, about some sort of thing related to gender or related to sociology, and then I read the academic theory that then explains what I had a hunch about, it feels very validating and it feels very exciting to know that how I felt about a certain subject is validated in what the theory shows. And so when reading an objective sort of framework of any sort of written work, you get sort of the raw data. You get the idea of what is happening. But the problem is, as you read that, you're interpreting it through your subjective lens. You are understanding what you are engaging with in terms of how you already think as an individual. And so the difference between objective and subjective perspectives is that if you approach things from a subjective perspective, you can provoke the way people think to change rather than just changing the data. As in, you know, the objective data about how the movie was made can teach you about how the movie was made. But hearing someone's subjective perspective on the movie can make you look at it from a different perspective, which can then change the way you see the movie for better or worse. And so this is why, to me, subjective perspectives and subjective experiences are super valuable and are actually in many ways more valuable than objective perspectives on art specifically. Because when it comes to art, there really isn't such thing as an objective analysis or review of a movie. You can do a plot summary, you can do a sort of, you know, rundown of what happened behind the scenes, and that can be as close as you can get to objective, but still what information you decide to put in, what information you decide to leave out, how you frame that information inherently will make it subjective. And the thing is, there are degrees of objectivity versus subjectivity. Saying, for example, I didn't like this movie because it made me cry, that's extremely subjective versus complaining about the portrayal of people of color in a film can be more objective, but it still has a subjective component, which is how you value the appropriate usage of representation of race in media. And so no matter what, you're going to get a subjective perspective on art. But because certain things can be framed on more objective terms and can be framed in a more pseudo-academic tone, you can convince people that an opinion is a fact. And this is a major issue in the video essay format, where a lot of people have gotten really popular off of speaking authoritatively about what is essentially their opinion. And my goal as a video maker has always been to not do that. And maybe I do sometimes use language that implies that I'm speaking outside of my own perspective, but I never mean to do that. I always approach it as, this is how the film affected me. This is how a video game affected me while I played it, or while I watched a movie, or while I watched a TV show. And so, it's like, if I watch an objective review of, let's just say, The Shining, versus a subjective review that goes into how they experienced The Shining, I feel like I'm going to learn a lot more from getting out of my line of thinking by watching the subjective version. The objective version might teach me facts, but those facts will be suited into my interpretation, into my framework through which I understand the art. If I already believe, for example, which I do say in my video, if I already believe that the film is about the deconstruction and, destruction of a nuclear family because of toxic masculinity, if I see it that way, then knowing the objective facts about how the film was made isn't going to greatly alter that interpretation. However, an opinion that is different from that perspective entirely might convince me to think more about other ways it could be read or problems with my own interpretation. And so the subjective perspective on art is, to me, more valuable because we can learn more from it and we can take away more from it. But the issue of the objective being seen as superior is simultaneously just an issue of poor framing in general and also a feminist issue because, and this is a bit conjecture, I haven't read full-on studies or anything about this, but as far as I can tell, objectivity is masculinized. My understanding of objectivity is that how it's constructed is in favor of dominant groups. And I covered this in one of the videos of my gaming culture series that if, for example, you use the objective framework of critical reception for video games, divorced from the real world, that might sound like an objective standard for art because if every reviewer ever says that a game is a good game, then we might as well say it's objectively good. But the problem with that is that that's in a vacuum. In reality, the games that get the best critical reception tend to have the most budget going into them and the most like power going into the making of it. Like there will be, cult hits like Depression Quest, but the big ones that get the most coverage have the most budget. The games that have the most budget are the games that have the biggest market, and within the gaming market, men dominate the market and dominate the field of creating games. So most of the critically acclaimed games will be made by men and will be made for men. And so as a result, if we're going to go off objective standards for verifying what games are the best, all the best games are going to be coincidentally games that are for men. And so that devalues women's perspectives and non-binary perspectives and trans perspectives because it constructs a supposed apolitical measurement for validating the status quo, basically. And the same is true of objective approaches to art analysis in video essays. By valuing the technicals, for example, the technicals are stereotyped as something that men like and something that men are good at. I've been looking into this in depth because of the video I'm working on for the Red Pill community, which will be out hopefully soon. And they say, women like people and men like things, men like machines. And so this idea that men like technical aspects of stuff is a stereotype. But the stereotype has consequences for how things manifest themselves, where technical fields like engineering are fields that are dominated by men, which makes it harder for women to break into it. And then once they break into it, they're paid less, and they deal with a lot of harassment and discouragement and discrimination. And then on top of that, they're not socialized to sort of be driven down the path towards technical stuff from an early age. So they either have to consciously take on the decision to focus on technical aspects, or they're fucked. They're screwed out of the ability to actually do that stuff. And, I don't know anything about technical stuff. My videos are terrible. I don't know how to handle the technical side of things at all. That's just never been me. And so I go for the subjective stuff. And this idea that the objective stuff is all that matters coincides with this idea that, men only like the technical stuff and only care about the technical details of art rather than what they mean or how they influence you or how they affect life. And so the objective stuff that they sort of act is just inherently superior to subjective stuff is, technical details, which are things that men are given more opportunity to understand and more opportunity to master, and also they're seen as more authoritative within that discipline. And so immediately, because a man talks about technical details, he will get better views than a woman talking about how a movie made her feel. And adding to that, a woman talking about technical details will probably also do better than a woman talking about how, the movie made her feel. And this is conjecture, of course. I'm not pulling up any statistics to try to prove it or anything. But I also feel that it would be the case where if a man talked about subjective stuff, that would be valued more than if a woman talked about subjective stuff. So there's this sort of masculinization of objectivity and feminization of subjectivity. And this also manifests itself in a lot of political rhetoric, things like reals before feels. People say that in direct response to trans women. And what I find interesting about that is this idea that biology is real and feeling like a woman is not real. And so trans women are inherently not women because the technical side of people's bodies overrides the subjective experience of how it feels to be in that body. And so, again, the objective versus subjectivity sort of debate is one that lends itself really well to something like transphobia and trans misogyny and also just plain misogyny. And so I think what needs to happen for video essays to really be a better genre is, first of all, we need more women and more marginalized people in general getting more popularity. We need women covering technical stuff, but we also need women covering subjective stuff, how movies make us feel, what we gain from them, what we lose from them, how we how we give ourselves to films and how films give back to us and things like that. We need to make that more valuable as an analysis, as a perspective. Subjective perspectives need to be more valuable. And that's one of the major issues with the video essay format, is that it's becoming increasingly, to me, masculinized. That manifests itself in the popularity of the creators all being men and mostly covering technical aspects. And it also manifests itself in the devaluing of subjective reviews and analysis. So I guess the question is, how do we sort of teach people to value subjective experiences? And to that, I go back to my comparison to reading academia, because that the text itself is one thing, but the frame of mind that you are in when you read that text is another thing. And teaching people that it's good to experience the other frames of mind, the other frames of reference, the other way that people view things, the other lens of viewing things. I think teaching people how to be okay with that is like the next step. And ironically, that's what feminist media criticism is. But the internet has rejected feminist media critique in droves because Gamergate. And I mean, if you want to know more about that, I've made at least a few videos about that at this point. So yeah, basically, anybody who's listening, if you have any ideas for how to introduce subjective perspectives into the more mainstream consciousness of film reviews and game reviews and the general video essay format, if you have any ideas for that, feel free to comment. And if you also have your own perspective on these topics in general, feel free to comment. I tend to take the perspective of anyone seriously as long as the person isn't like a total asshole. Like if they're a conspiracy theorist, then I'm not going to take them seriously. But generally speaking, I tend to treat any comment as though it was said by, a friend rather than some faceless nobody who I'm better than. And the reason why is because I think the subjective experience is super valuable. And for me, I just think the next step for addressing the issue of feminist issues within video essays as a format is addressing the issue of the devaluation of subjectivity. And if that interests you, then feel free to comment. That's all I have to say. Bye.